Hey everyone, tonight we have something a little different. 4 journeys in one. We're going to spend time with the medieval alchemist who had a very particular relationship with certain herbs, the ancient naval commander who understood that the sea was a weapon before the ships were. We're going to walk with Cyrus the Great from the moment he was a minor king of a minor kingdom to the moment he stood in the largest empire the world had ever seen. And we're going to look at something so personal and so universal that it crosses every culture and every century. What your hair said about who you were in the ancient world. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world had a complicated, rich, and frequently misunderstood relationship with substances that alter consciousness. The popular image of the Middle Ages as a period of unrelieved sobriety, broken only by the occasional flagellation and plague, is almost entirely wrong. Medieval people drank heavily, took herbal preparations that would make a modern pharmacologist raise their eyebrows, and lived in a world where the boundary between medicine, religion, and intoxication was far more porous than the modern world's categories suggest. The substance culture of medieval Europe is not a story of secret vice. It is a story of a society that understood altered consciousness differently from the way we do, embedded it in different frameworks of meaning, and managed it according to different rules. To understand what getting high meant in medieval times, you first have to understand what the medieval world believed about the mind and the body and their relationship to the spiritual world. The dominant framework, heavily influenced by the Greek medical tradition of Galen, filtered through centuries of Islamic scholarship and overlaid with the Christian theological tradition, understood the human body as a system of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours, in correct balance, produced health. In imbalance, they produced illness. The substances that medieval people consumed, whether for pleasure, for medicine, or for religious experience, were understood through this framework. They altered the humoral balance, and the alteration produced specific effects that were categorized and managed according to the humoral theory. Our companion through this segment is Brother Thomas, a Benedictine monk in a monastery in the Rhine Valley in the 12th century, who is also the monastery's herbalist, responsible for the physis garden and the preparation of the herbal medicines that the monastery provides to both its monks and the surrounding community. Brother Thomas is a man of genuine learning. He has read Hildegard of Bingen's Physica and Conseil et Cure. He knows the Arabic medical texts that have recently arrived in Europe through the translation movement centered in Toledo, and he maintains a personal notebook in which he records his observations about the plants in his care with a scientific attention that his century does not have the framework to fully evaluate. He's also, in the specific way of a medieval herbalist, intimately familiar with which of his plants make you sleepy, which make you see things, and which, in the wrong dose, will kill you. Before we get to the more exotic substances, we need to establish the baseline, which is alcohol, because medieval Europeans drank in quantities that would hospitalize most modern people, and they drank at every meal and every social occasion and many religious ones. The water supply in medieval towns and cities was genuinely unsafe. The connection between contaminated water and disease was not understood, but the practical reality was that water from urban sources was frequently the vehicle for the bacteria that caused dysentery and typhoid and other waterborne illnesses that killed people regularly. Beer and wine, whose production involves processes that kill most harmful bacteria, were therefore safer than water, and this safety rationale combined with the genuine pleasure of the effect to make alcohol the universal beverage of medieval European life. Medieval ale, the dominant drink for most of the population, is different from modern beer in several important ways. It contains no hops, which were not widely used in English brewing until the 15th century, and it is therefore sweeter and less bitter than modern beer. It is lower in alcohol than modern beer, somewhere between 1 and 3%, which makes it more of a nutritional beverage than an intoxicating one in normal quantities. But it is drunk in very large quantities. A gallon or more per day for a working adult is documented in the records of medieval institutions, which means the cumulative effect is significant. Medieval people were not stumbling around drunk all day, but they were operating at a level of mild, continuous alcohol intake that would strike the modern person as unusual. Wine is the drink of the wealthy and the clergy, the latter because wine is essential to the mass, and because monasteries are major producers of it. The wines of medieval Europe are different from their modern counterparts in ways that make comparison difficult. They're often made from grape varieties that no longer exist. They're frequently spiced with honey and aromatics to preserve them and to mask the effects of imperfect fermentation, and they're often drunk young and slightly cloudy. The spiced wine, known as Hippocras, named after a straining bag called a Hippocrates sleeve, is a medieval luxury drink made from wine sweetened with honey and spiced with ginger and cinnamon and other aromatics, and it represents the upper end of medieval alcohol culture, a beverage that is simultaneously pleasurable and medicinal, the herbs providing therapeutic benefit while the wine provides the vehicle and the honey provides the sweetness. Brother Thomas produces a spiced wine each winter for the infirmary. He uses the monastery's own wine, adds honey from the monastery's bees, and spices it with ginger and pepper and a small amount of clove, which he's learned from the Arabic medical texts has warming properties appropriate for the cold months. He gives it to the monks who are ill and to the elderly brothers who feel the cold more than the others, and he gives himself a small cup each evening before Compline, which he records in his notebook as a medicinal precaution against the chill of the Rhine Valley winter. Whether it is truly medicinal, or whether Brother Thomas simply enjoys it, is a distinction that the 12th century does not consider particularly important, and that he has decided is not worth examining too closely. The medieval herbalist garden contained a number of plants whose psychoactive properties were well known and carefully managed. The most important of these are the plants that belong to what we now call the nightshade family: henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and datura, whose active compounds are alkaloids that act on the nervous system in ways that produce hallucinations, delirium, and in higher doses death. These plants were not hidden or secret in the medieval world. They are described in the major herbals, their properties carefully listed, their medicinal uses documented alongside the warnings about their toxicity. They were used as anesthetics. Patients undergoing surgery were given preparations containing these plants to reduce their awareness of what was happening to them, and as treatments for pain, as components of preparations for skin conditions, and as ingredients in the flying ointments that the trial records of later witch persecutions describe. Henbane, or Sciamus niger, is perhaps the most widely used psychoactive plant in the medieval world, and its history in European culture goes back to antiquity. Its seeds, when burned, produce a smoke that causes hallucinations and euphoria, and its leaves and roots, when prepared in various ways, produce a range of effects from sedation to delirium depending on the dose. It was used medicinally for toothache, rubbing the leaves on the gums or smoking the seeds near the affected tooth, for rheumatic pain, and for insomnia. It was also, in a different register, the plant most commonly associated with witches, and with the preparation of the flying ointments that the later witch trial records describe. Though the scholarship on what these ointments actually contained and what effect they actually produced is considerably more complex than the dramatic trial testimony suggests. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, is the most mythologically loaded plant in the medieval pharmacopoeia, surrounded by a body of folklore that has accumulated over centuries of use and that Brother Thomas treats with a mixture of respect and skepticism. The mandrake root, which can be shaped vaguely like a human figure, is associated in medieval tradition with a variety of magical properties. It screams when pulled from the ground, killing anyone who hears the scream. It must be pulled by a dog tied to the root. It ensures fertility and protects against demons. Brother Thomas pulls his mandrake roots himself, at night, with a cloth over his ears, not because he believes the screaming legend, but because the tradition of respectful handling seems appropriate for a plant whose pharmacological properties are real and serious. The mandrake's alkaloids produce sedation, hallucination, and anticholinergic effects that have been used in medicine since antiquity, and Brother Thomas uses it carefully in preparations for severe pain and for the difficult labours that the monastery's midwife brings to his attention. Cannabis, hemp, is a plant that the medieval world uses primarily for its fibre rather than its psychoactive properties, but that exists in the medieval European world in ways that make complete ignorance of its effects unlikely. Hemp was widely grown throughout medieval Europe for rope and cloth, and the pollen and the plant material would have been in constant contact with the people who grew and processed it. Whether medieval people deliberately used hemp for its psychoactive effects in Western Europe is a matter of genuine historical debate. The evidence is less clear than enthusiastic popular history sometimes suggests, but it is certain that the plant's properties were known to the Arabic medical tradition that Brother Thomas has been reading, and that preparations of cannabis resin were documented in that tradition as treatments for pain and for the specific condition that the Arabic texts call hashishi, from which the word assassin may derive. The flying ointments that appear in the trial records of the witch persecutions of the late medieval and early modern period are one of the most fascinating intersections of pharmacology and folklore in European history. The accounts of witches anointing themselves with a greasy preparation and then flying to the Sabbath on broomsticks are, in the trial records, presented as literal descriptions of events that took place. The scholarly interpretation of these accounts is more complex. Many historians now believe that the flying ointments, which trial records and some confessional accounts describe as made from the fat of unbaptized infants combined with various plant materials, may in fact have been preparations containing the alkaloids of the nightshade plants, henbane, belladonna, mandrake, datura, that produce vivid hallucinations of flying when absorbed through the skin. The pharmacology supports this interpretation. Absorption of alkaloids through the skin of the armpits or the mucous membranes, which the broomstick application method would facilitate, is an efficient route of administration, and the alkaloids of the nightshade plants produce at low doses a specific type of hallucination that includes the sensation of flying, of moving through the air, of being transported to distant places. The witch who has applied the ointment and believes she has flown to the Sabbath may have experienced a genuine hallucinogenic episode whose content was shaped by the expectations and the cultural narrative that her community provided. She did not fly. She did have a powerful drug experience. The trial that followed made no distinction between these two possibilities, and the people who died as a result of the confusion were not flying either. Brother Thomas knows about the flying ointments. He has encountered accounts of them in his reading, and he's been consulted once, carefully at a distance with considerable circumspection on both sides, by a woman in the village who wanted to know whether the preparation she'd been given by an older woman was safe. He looked at what she described, identified the likely plant materials, and told her that the preparation would make her extremely ill and might kill her and that she should not use it. He did not report her to the priest, because he had decided that this would make things considerably worse, and that the woman had already been frightened sufficiently by his description of the preparation's effects. He is not sure this was the correct decision. He has made many decisions that he is not sure are correct. The physic garden does not offer certainty, it offers knowledge, which is different. Opium, the dried sap of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, is known to the medieval world and used in medieval medicine. though its use in Western Europe in the medieval period is less systematic than in the Islamic world, where a sophisticated tradition of opium preparation and administration has developed over centuries. The opium poppy grows in medieval Europe and was used in antiquity, but the specific techniques of preparing and administering opium that make it reliably useful, as opposed to erratically dangerous, were developed primarily in the Arabic medical tradition and reached Western Europe through the translation movement of the 12th century. The medieval preparation known as dwale, a soporific preparation used to render patients unconscious for surgery, is one of the most interesting pharmaceutical documents of the medieval period, and it appears in several English manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries. The preparation involves a combination of henbane, hemlock, wild neep, lettuce, opium, and bile dissolved in wine or vinegar. This is a genuinely effective anesthetic preparation. The combination of opioids from the opium and anticholinergics from the henbane and hemlock would produce sedation and reduce pain sensitivity, and it is also an extremely dangerous one, since the margin between the dose that produces unconsciousness and the dose that produces death is narrow and variable. The medieval surgeon who administered dwale was making a pharmacological judgment that required both knowledge and luck, and the patients who survived medieval surgery survived a procedure that was dangerous from before the first cut. Brother Thomas uses opium preparations cautiously, in small doses, for pain that is not manageable by other means. He has learned from bitter experience, one death that he attributes directly to his own error in dosing, that the opium poppy demands respect that other plants in his garden do not, and his notebook entries about opium are more careful and more detailed than those for any other plant. The doses recorded precisely, the effects noted, the warnings underlined. He thinks of this death regularly. He thinks of it when he prepares any opium preparation, which he does rarely, and he thinks of it in the night when the question of whether his knowledge is adequate to the responsibility his position places on him presents itself, as it regularly does, in the space between matins and lauds, when the monastery is quiet and there is nothing between Brother Thomas and his thoughts. The boundary between getting high and religious experience in the medieval world is not where the modern mind might expect it to be. The Christian tradition has a deeply ambivalent relationship with ecstatic religious experience. It celebrates the mystical visions of the great mystics, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, while also being suspicious of any claim to direct divine experience that bypasses the institutional mediation of the Church. The relationship between certain forms of religious practice and certain psychoactive substances in the medieval world is a subject that scholars approach carefully, but there is enough evidence in the record to suggest that the two were not always as separate as the institutional Church would have preferred. Ergot, the fungus Claviceps purpurea that infects rye and other grains, is the most consequential psychoactive substance in medieval European history that was not used deliberately. When ergot-infected grain is consumed, the alkaloids it contains produce a condition known as ergotism, St. Anthony's fire, which includes convulsions, hallucinations, a burning sensation in the extremities, and in severe cases gangrene. Outbreaks of ergotism swept through medieval European communities periodically, and the mass hallucinations they produced were interpreted through the available religious framework. They were visions, they were divine punishments, they were attacks by demons. The famous dancing plague of 1374, in which hundreds of people in the Rhineland began uncontrollable dancing that lasted for days, may have been an ergotism outbreak. The Salem witch trials of 1692 have been attributed, in a well-known scholarly hypothesis, to ergotism in the rye harvest. The medieval world experienced the effects of ergot without understanding their cause, and the experiences it produced entered the cultural and religious life of the community as something else entirely. Brother Thomas has seen ergotism. He has treated the burning limbs and the convulsions of an outbreak in the village 3 winters ago, when the rye harvest was poor and the stored grain had been kept in conditions that favoured the fungus's growth. He did not know what caused it. The connection between the contaminated grain and the symptoms would not be established for centuries, but he noticed that the outbreak affected those who ate the rye bread and not those who ate wheat bread, and he advised the village headman to discard the remaining rye stores and distribute wheat from the monastery's granary. The outbreak ended. Brother Thomas recorded in his notebook that the rye bread appeared to be the cause, without knowing why, and noted that this should be investigated further. It would be, just not for another 500 years. Ancient naval warfare is one of the most technically demanding and physically brutal forms of combat that the ancient world produced, and it is one of the least understood by modern readers who tend to think of ancient warships as slow and clumsy predecessors of the sailing ships they are more familiar with. The trireme, the Greek warship that dominated Mediterranean warfare from the 6th to the 4th century BCE, is in fact one of the most sophisticated human-powered machines ever built. A vessel of extraordinary speed and maneuverability, whose operation requires the coordination of 170 oarsmen working in 3 banks to produce a speed and a tactical capability that modern reconstructions have confirmed and that contemporary accounts celebrate with a wonder that is entirely justified. Our companion through this segment is Nicias, a trireme captain in the Athenian fleet during the period of the Peloponnesian War. Not the historical Nicias who commanded the disastrous Sicilian expedition, but a fictional composite of the Athenian naval officer class, whose experience and perspective illuminate what it actually meant to fight at sea in the ancient world. Nicias has been commanding triremes for 15 years. He knows a ship the way a horseman knows a difficult horse, its particular tendencies, its best performance conditions, the way it responds in different sea states, the specific qualities of the crew that make the difference between a ship that can hit 12 knots in a sprint and one that cannot. He is good at what he does, and what he does is one of the most technically demanding military specialities in the ancient world. The trireme is approximately 37 metres long and 6 metres wide, built from fir for the hull and pine for the internal structure, with bronze fittings at the ram, the embolon, at the bow that is the trireme's primary weapon. It is powered by 170 oarsmen arranged in 3 banks, the thronites at the top, the zygites in the middle, and the thalamites at the bottom, each pulling an oar of different length adjusted to their position, the whole system coordinated by the Kelliustes, the stroke caller, who maintains the rhythm that keeps the 3 banks in synchronization. At full sprint, the trireme can reach 12 to 13 knots, considerably faster than the sailing ships of the period, and at this speed the bronze ram at its bow can penetrate the hull of an enemy ship with enough force to sink it. The trireme's speed and maneuverability are its defining military qualities, and both depend entirely on the quality of the crew. The oarsmen of the Athenian fleet, the thetes, the lowest class of Athenian citizen, are professional rowers who train constantly because the physical conditioning and the coordination required to row a trireme at combat speed is genuinely demanding. A trireme crew that has been together for months and has developed the specific rhythm and coordination that high-speed rowing requires is a military instrument of extraordinary effectiveness. A crew of untrained or poorly coordinated rowers is a slow and vulnerable ship. The Athenian naval dominance of the 5th century BCE is not primarily about ship design. The Corinthians and the Persians build essentially similar ships, but about the quality of the crews that Athens can put in those ships, which is a function of the city's maritime culture and its willingness to invest in training. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is the most consequential naval engagement in the history of the ancient world, and it is worth understanding in some detail because it is the moment that determines whether Greek civilization survives the Persian invasion or is absorbed into the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian fleet, estimated at between 300 and 800 ships, the sources disagree dramatically, confronts the Greek fleet of approximately 370 triremes in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. The narrowness of the strait is the key tactical factor. In open water, the Persian numerical advantage would likely be decisive, but in the constricted space of the Salamis Channel, the Persian fleet cannot deploy its numbers effectively. The Athenian commander Themistocles, one of the great strategic minds of the ancient world, has chosen the Salamis Strait deliberately and has reportedly lured the Persian fleet into it through a deception, sending a message to Xerxes suggesting that the Greek fleet is about to flee, encouraging the Persians to block the exits from the strait during the night, thereby committing themselves to a battle in conditions that favour the Greeks. Whether this story is precisely accurate or partly legendary is difficult to determine, but the outcome is not in dispute. The Persian fleet, attempting to manoeuvre in the narrow strait, becomes tangled in its own confusion, and the Greek triremes, more manoeuvrable in the confined space, systematically ram and sink the Persian ships from mid-morning until late afternoon. The Persian fleet loses perhaps 200 ships. The Greek fleet loses perhaps 40. Xerxes watches from a throne on the shore. It is the worst afternoon of his reign. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the naval engagement that ends the Roman civil wars and establishes Octavian as the sole ruler of the Roman world, is a different kind of naval battle, fought with different ships and different tactics, and its outcome determines the political character of the next 4 centuries of European history. Mark Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet faces Octavian's fleet under Agrippa in the waters off the coast of northwestern Greece. Antony's ships are larger, the heavy kinkaremes and hexaremes that carry artillery and marines, but Agrippa's ships are faster and more manoeuvrable. The battle is decided not by a clean tactical victory, but by the defection of a portion of Antony's fleet and by Cleopatra's famous withdrawal with 60 ships, followed by Antony himself, which demoralizes the remaining force sufficiently to cause its collapse. The outcome makes Octavian Augustus, which makes the Roman Empire, which makes the Western world that follows. Nicias has thought about Salamis' whole naval life, the way that military professionals think about the defining battles of their tradition, as case studies, as lessons, as the standard against which contemporary performance is measured. He's walked the Salamis Strait on the shore, tried to imagine what the Persian commanders saw when their ships began to tangle, tried to understand the moment when numerical advantage became a liability rather than an asset. He thinks about this particularly when he is in tight waters, when the fleet is navigating a narrow channel, when the maneuverability of his individual ship matters more than the numbers of the fleet. And he believes that Themistocles' greatest achievement was not the victory itself, but the forcing of the battle into conditions where the better crew, rather than the greater number, would decide it. This is the principle Nicias tries to apply in his own tactical thinking. Find the conditions where your specific advantage, the crew, the speed, the training, determines the outcome. The physical experience of serving on a trireme is one of the most demanding in the ancient world, and the conditions under which the oarsmen lived and worked are barely imaginable by modern standards of military service. The trireme has no below-decks accommodation. The hull is almost entirely occupied by the 3 banks of oarsmen, and the crew of approximately 200, including the oarsmen, the officers, the marines, and the sailors who manage the sails and the rigging, sleep on shore whenever possible and on deck when shore is not available. A fleet on campaign beaches its ships every evening. The trireme's hull absorbs water and becomes heavier and slower if kept in the water too long. and the oarsmen sleep on the beach beside their ship, returning to the oar before dawn. The diet of the trireme crew on campaign is simple and inadequate by modern nutritional standards. Grain, olives, onions, dried fish, and whatever can be foraged or purchased from the coastal communities the fleet passes through. The oarsmen consume enormous quantities of food. The caloric demand of sustained high-intensity rowing is very large, and the provisioning of a fleet of 100 or more triremes is a logistical challenge that the ancient sources document as a constant preoccupation of fleet commanders. Running out of food means a fleet cannot row effectively, which means a fleet cannot fight, which means the food supply is as important as the bronze rams and the trained crews. The physical toll of rowing a trireme at combat speed is documented in the ancient sources and in the modern reconstruction experiments conducted with the Olympias, the full-scale trireme replica built in the 1980s. The oarsmen of the Olympias, volunteers rather than professionals, and therefore less conditioned than ancient naval oarsmen, achieved speeds of close to 9 knots in their best trials, somewhat below the ancient accounts' claims of 12 to 13, but sufficient to demonstrate that the ancient sources are not simply boasting. The experience of rowing at these speeds, the reconstruction volunteers reported, is one of total physical commitment. There is no reserve capacity, no margin for error, no possibility of anything less than complete coordination between all the oarsmen simultaneously. The body is a machine in these moments, and the machine either works or it does not. Cyrus II, the man who will be called the Great, is born around 600 BCE into the royal family of the Achaemenid clan, a lineage that rules the small kingdom of Anshan in the region of Persis in what is now southwestern Iran. At the time of his birth, Anshan is a tributary state of the Median Empire, a considerably larger and more powerful kingdom that controls the Iranian plateau and the surrounding regions, and that regards the Persian kings of Anshan as minor clients, useful for their military service and their tribute payments, and not threatening to the Median hegemony. The child who will overthrow this order and build the largest empire the world has seen is born into a position of subordination that he will spend the first decades of his adult life appearing to accept. The biographical sources for Cyrus's early life are a mixture of the genuinely historical and the legendary that is very difficult to separate, because the ancient world's interest in great men produces in each case a body of founding myths that accumulates around the historical person and eventually becomes inseparable from it. The most elaborate account of Cyrus's origins is in Herodotus, who gives us a story that is clearly folkloric in its structure. The infant of royal blood exposed by a frightened king, raised by a shepherd, discovered in his true nature, restored to his destiny. But that may contain historical kernels. Modern scholars believe the historical Cyrus was raised at the Median court as a hostage for his father's good behaviour, which would give him both the insider knowledge of the empire he will later overthrow and the particular psychological motivation of a person who's been simultaneously privileged and subordinated. The Median Empire that Cyrus grows up within and eventually against is itself a relatively new construction. It has been the dominant power on the Iranian plateau for less than a century, having destroyed the Assyrian Empire in coalition with Babylon in 612 BCE. The Median king Astyages, Cyrus's maternal grandfather according to Herodotus, is a ruler who has maintained his empire through the traditional mechanisms of tribute extraction and military coercion, and who has allowed a degree of administrative slackness in the tributary kingdoms that a more careful monarch would not have permitted. When Cyrus begins to build his power base in Persis, he is exploiting weaknesses that Astyages has created through his own governance, and the revolt when it comes is as much a product of Median institutional failure as of Cyrus's genius. Cyrus's revolt against the Medes begins around 553 BCE, and the ancient sources describe it in terms that suggest both careful preparation and a degree of luck that the prepared person is positioned to exploit. The Median army that marches against Cyrus is undermined before a battle is fought. The Median general Harpagus, who has personal grievances against Astyages dating from an episode of extraordinary brutality in which Astyages fed Harpagus his own son as punishment for a perceived disobedience, defects to Cyrus during the campaign and brings a portion of the Median army with him. Astyages attempts to command his remaining forces personally, but is captured. Cyrus enters the Median capital of Ecbatana without the wholesale destruction that contemporary conquerors routinely employed. What Cyrus does at Ecbatana establishes the template for everything that follows. He does not destroy the city. He does not massacre the population. He does not depose the Median administrative class and replace it wholesale with Persians. He treats Astyages, the king he has overthrown, with a respect that the ancient sources find remarkable, and that later tradition elevates into a defining expression of Cyrus's character. The Median Empire becomes the Persian Empire through a process of absorption rather than destruction. The Medians are incorporated into the new imperial system with their culture, their institutions, and their social position largely intact. The message this sends to the next potential conquest is explicit. Submit to Cyrus, and you will be treated well. This message is received, and it shapes the subsequent history of the empire's expansion. The absorption of the Median Empire gives Cyrus not just territory, but the administrative infrastructure of a functioning imperial state. The roads, the tribute networks, the bureaucratic traditions that the Medes had inherited from the Assyrians and extended across the Iranian plateau. He is not building from nothing. He is taking over and refining an existing system, and the specific genius of his approach is the recognition that the system is more valuable intact than destroyed. The conqueror who burns the cities and massacres the population has a conquered wasteland. The conqueror who preserves the cities and maintains the population has a functioning economy that generates the revenue that funds the next conquest. The fall of Lydia in 547 BCE brings Cyrus to the shores of the Aegean and makes him master of the richest kingdom in the Western world. Croesus of Lydia, whose name has become synonymous with wealth in every language that has encountered the ancient world, rules a kingdom whose river Pactolus carries gold dust from the mountains, whose craftsmen produced the first coined money in history, and whose commercial connections make Sardis, the Lydian capital, one of the wealthiest cities of the ancient Near East. Croesus is also, according to Herodotus, a man who has consulted the oracle at Delphi about the wisdom of attacking Persia and received the oracle's famous ambiguous response. If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire. He crosses the river, he destroys a great empire, his own. The campaign against Lydia is Cyrus's first major Western campaign, and it demonstrates the military intelligence that will characterize his approach throughout. When Croesus, finding his initial campaign inconclusive, withdraws to Sardis for the winter, the campaigning season in the ancient world typically ends in autumn, when armies return to their bases. Cyrus does not do what Croesus expects. He does not withdraw. He follows Croesus to Sardis, arriving before Croesus has time to summon his allies, and engages the Lydian army outside the city with a specific tactical innovation. He places his camels in front of his cavalry. The horses of the Lydian cavalry, legendary riders, among the best mounted warriors in the ancient world, refuse to approach the camels, whose smell is unfamiliar to them, and the Lydian cavalry charge breaks down before it is launched. Sardis falls within 2 weeks. The treatment of Croesus after his defeat is one of the most famous stories of the ancient world, and it operates in the historical tradition as the defining expression of Cyrus's clemency. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus initially ordered Croesus to be burned alive, the great pyre prepared, Croesus on it, and then, Seeing Croesus call out the name of Solon the Athenian sage, who had once told him that no man should be counted happy until he is dead, Cyrus relents, stays the execution, and keeps Croesus at his court as an advisor. Whether the details are precisely accurate is secondary to the message the story carries. Cyrus is a conqueror who can be moved by the recognition of a fellow human being's suffering, who can change his mind, who treats the defeated with a magnanimity that the brutal standards of ancient conquest do not require. This reputation, carefully maintained and carefully deployed, is one of the most powerful political tools in the Achaemenid arsenal. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE is the culmination of Cyrus's western campaigns and one of the most consequential events of the ancient world. We have already visited this moment earlier in our history of the Persian Empire, but it is worth returning to it here because in the context of Cyrus's personal story, it represents something specific. The moment when a man who began as a minor king of a minor kingdom has become the ruler of the most powerful state in the world. He has done this in perhaps 20 years of continuous expansion, from the overthrow of the Medes to the conquest of Lydia, to the absorption of the Greek cities of Anatolia, to the campaigns in Central Asia, and now the fall of Babylon, and the speed of the accumulation is as remarkable as its scale. Babylon does not fall in the conventional sense. It is not taken by storm, its walls breached, its population massacred. It is taken through a combination of political intelligence and the specific failure of the last Babylonian king Nabonidus to maintain the religious and civic institutions that the city's population expected of its ruler. Nabonidus had spent years away from Babylon on campaigns in Arabia, had neglected the great New Year festival of Marduk that the king was expected to perform, and had moved the cult statues of the provincial gods to Babylon in a way that offended both the provincial populations and the Babylonian priests. When Cyrus arrives, he is greeted by a population that has been prepared by Nabonidus's failures to find in the Persian king an improvement. The Cyrus cylinder, the clay barrel inscribed in cuneiform that Cyrus deposits in the foundations of a Babylonian temple after the conquest, is the document that establishes his claim to be the liberator rather than the conqueror of Babylon. It announces the return of the displaced cult statues to their original temples, the release of the peoples held in Babylon against their will, including the Jews exiled from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and presents Cyrus as the chosen instrument of the Babylonian god Marduk, sent to restore proper worship after the impiety of Nabonidus. It is propaganda of extraordinary sophistication, and it is also, in the specific terms of what Cyrus actually does, largely accurate. The cult statues are returned, the exiles are permitted to go home, the Babylonian administrative structure is preserved. The Cyrus cylinder is sometimes called the first declaration of human rights, which is an anachronistic reading that imports modern categories into an ancient document. But the impulse behind that reading is not entirely wrong. It is a document that insists on the dignity of conquered peoples, in terms that the ancient world rarely employs. Cyrus dies in 530 BCE on campaign in Central Asia, fighting the Massagetì nomads in what is now Turkmenistan. The circumstances of his death are uncertain. Herodotus gives us a dramatic account in which the Massagetì queen Tomyris, whose son Cyrus had captured and who had died in captivity, defeats Cyrus in battle and dips his severed head in a vessel of blood, telling him to drink his fill of the blood he had always craved. This story is almost certainly legendary in its details, but Cyrus does die on campaign, which is historically established, and the death of the founder in the field is a fitting end to a life spent in motion. The tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae, the first capital he built for himself after the overthrow of the Medes, is a simple stone structure on a stepped platform in a garden that was once famous for its beauty. Alexander the Great, when he visited it after his conquest of the Persian Empire, reportedly found it plundered and ordered its restoration and the punishment of those responsible. He was moved enough by the simplicity and the dignity of the tomb to order that it be maintained and respected. The inscription that Alexander reportedly read on the tomb, whether the attribution is genuine or later legend, is one of the most affecting documents of the ancient world. I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Grudge me not, therefore, this little earth that covers my body. What Cyrus left behind is not just an empire. The empire was extended and eventually lost like all empires. What he left behind is a model of governance that influenced every subsequent large-scale political organization in the Western tradition. The model of ruling diversity through tolerance rather than forced homogenization, of extracting revenue through administration rather than plunder, of treating conquered peoples with sufficient dignity to make their cooperation preferable to their resistance. These are not obvious principles, and the fact that Cyrus arrived at them in the 6th century BCE without a model to follow is a measure of the genuineness of his political genius. That the empire eventually became something different from this model under later rulers does not diminish what the model was. Every political tradition that has tried to govern diverse peoples with something approaching fairness has, knowingly or not, inherited something from Cyrus. Hair is one of the most powerful identity markers in human culture, and the ancient world understood this with a clarity and a specificity that the modern world, with its individual stylistic freedom, has partly lost. In the ancient world, your hair announced who you were, your social status, your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your marital status, your profession, your political affiliation, your state of mourning, your state of celebration, your relationship to the divine, with a communicative precision that required no translation and no verbal explanation. A person who walked through an ancient city was legible in their hair in a way that the modern person walking through a modern city is not, and the management of this legibility was a constant and culturally significant activity. Our companion through this segment is not a single character, but three: a woman from ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom period, a Roman man of the senatorial class in the 1st century CE, and a samurai warrior in 15th century Japan, because the range of what ancient hair could mean is best understood through the contrast of radically different cultural systems approaching the same universal human material. Ancient Egyptian hair culture is one of the most elaborate and most thoroughly documented in the ancient world, and it begins with a fact that surprises most modern readers. The Egyptians often shaved their heads. The combination of the Egyptian climate, hot, dusty, prone to lice, and the Egyptian aesthetic, which celebrated cleanliness and order with the rigor of a culture that equated physical order with cosmic order, made a shaved or closely cropped head the practical baseline for many Egyptians, including many wealthy ones. What the wealthy and the powerful then did was put on a wig, and the wig, rather than the natural hair, was the medium of social expression. Egyptian wigs are objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, made from human hair, horsehair, palm leaf fibre and wool in various combinations, styled with beeswax and scented with oils, and worn as markers of social status and ceremonial occasion, with a formality that makes the modern wig look trivial. A wealthy Egyptian woman's wig collection was a significant asset. The wigs were expensive, they required skilled maintenance, and the specific style of wig worn on specific occasions communicated the wearer's status and the nature of the occasion with precision. The heavy, long, straight black wig that characterizes formal Egyptian depictions, the style we most associate with ancient Egypt, worn by everyone from Nefertiti to Cleopatra in the popular imagination, is the formal ceremonial style, the equivalent of the modern evening dress. The wigs worn for everyday life were lighter, shorter, and differently constructed. Children in ancient Egypt had a specific hairstyle that is one of the most recognizable in the ancient world, the side lock. Children of both sexes had their heads shaved except for a single lock of hair left on the right side, which was braided and allowed to grow while the rest of the head was kept shaved. This hairstyle appears in Egyptian art with great consistency from the Old Kingdom onward, and it is associated specifically with childhood. The sidelock is called the sidelock of youth, and its removal at puberty, when the young person transitions to adult hairstyles, marks the passage from childhood to adulthood with a specificity and a visibility that makes the transition socially legible. The god Horus is consistently depicted with the sidelock, which connects the divine child with the human children who wear it. Our Egyptian companion, a woman of the New Kingdom court, let us call her Nefertari in the tradition of many Egyptian women's names without specific historical identification, manages her wig with the same attention that a modern professional woman might bring to her work wardrobe. She owns 3 wigs, the heavy formal one for ceremonial occasions, a medium-length one for everyday use at court, and a shorter, lighter one for domestic activities. Each is stored on a wooden stand, maintained with beeswax and oil by a skilled servant, and brought out according to the occasion. Nefertari is aware that her wig is being read by everyone she encounters, that the choice of wig communicates her status, her mood, her understanding of the social requirements of each situation, and she makes these choices with the deliberateness of someone for whom appearance is a form of language. Roman hair culture is perhaps the most politically charged of the ancient world's hair systems, and it is one that has been extensively studied by classical scholars, precisely because the Roman sources, the portrait busts, the coins, the literary references, document hairstyles with unusual precision across several centuries of political change. In Rome, hair is politics, and the politics of hair can be read in the Imperial Portrait series, with an accuracy that allows scholars to date portrait busts to within a few decades by the hairstyle alone, which tells us something important about how seriously Roman society took the political communication embedded in personal appearance. The Roman male ideal in the Republican period is one of studied simplicity. The short, unadorned haircut of the Roman soldier and statesman, the mark of a man who is too occupied with important matters to concern himself with personal vanity. Julius Caesar, who in his later years grew his hair somewhat longer and combed it forward to conceal his baldness, was criticized by contemporaries for this vanity, in a way that reveals how loaded the political semiotics of hair were. A man who attended to his hair too carefully was suspected of insufficient seriousness, of prioritizing personal appearance over public duty. A political man's hair should say, "I have more important things to think about than this." Our Roman companion, a senator of the 1st century CE, let us call him Marcus Aemilius, visits his barber every morning, a visit that is both a grooming ritual and a social occasion. The Roman barbershop is a major public institution. The tonsors, the barbers, maintain shops throughout the city that function as informal social clubs, where news is exchanged and opinions are formed and political sentiment is gauged by the owner, who sees dozens of men every day and hears what they're saying. Marcus's barber has been his barber for 15 years, and knows both his preferred style, short on the sides, slightly longer on top following the current imperial fashion, and his personal and professional gossip with equal intimacy. The barbershop is, for Marcus, one of the primary social spaces of his daily life, as important in its own way as the baths or the forum. Roman women's hair is its own elaborate system of status communication, and the hairstyles of the imperial women, documented in their portrait busts with extraordinary detail, shift through fashion cycles that track the changing aesthetic preferences of successive imperial courts, with a precision that allows art historians to date female portrait busts to within a generation by the hairstyle. The elaborate coiffures of the Flavian period, the 1st century CEE, in which the hair is built up into towering constructions of curls and plaits, supported by internal wire frameworks, represent one extreme of Roman female hair culture. The simpler styles of the earlier Republican matron, the tutulus, the central parting, the hair pulled back and up, represent the other. The shift from simplicity to elaboration tracks the shift from Republican to imperial political culture, and the women who adopted the most elaborate styles were communicating not just fashion preference, but social aspiration and political alignment. The shonmage, the top-knot hairstyle of the Japanese samurai, is one of the most recognizable hairstyles in world history, and it is one whose specific form and meaning evolved significantly across the centuries of its use. The hairstyle that most people associate with the samurai, the head shaved at the front and the remaining hair tied in a top knot at the back, is the mature form of a style that began differently and that carried specific meanings that changed across the history of the warrior class. Understanding the shonmage requires understanding the relationship between hair, identity, and social status in Japanese culture more broadly, which is a relationship of unusual specificity and rigidity. Our Japanese companion, a samurai warrior in the Muromachi period of the 15th century, let us call him Takeda, in the tradition of the great samurai clans, maintains his chonmage with the same care that he maintains his weapons, because both are expressions of his status and his identity in ways that his culture does not separate. The shaved pate that is the base of the chonmage is maintained by a barber who comes to his household regularly, and the top knot that rises from the remaining hair at the back of the head is oiled and carefully arranged. The specific arrangement of the top knot, its height, its angle, the manner in which it is folded, communicates Takeda's rank and his clan affiliation in ways that are immediately readable to anyone in his social world. The cutting of the top knot, or its loss, carries weight in Japanese culture that no modern Western hairstyle change quite parallels. A samurai who loses his top knot in battle has been humiliated in a specific and profound way, because the top knot is not just a hairstyle, but a marker of his status as a warrior. The voluntary cutting of the top knot was the mark of retirement from military life. A samurai who became a Buddhist monk or who withdrew from active service cut his top knot as a formal statement of his changed status. The forced cutting of the top knot by an enemy or a lord was a humiliation equivalent to being stripped of rank, a physical mark of subordination that the body carried until the hair grew back. In the Meiji period, when the new government abolished the samurai class and made the chonmage optional, many samurai experienced the forced modernization of their hairstyle as a form of social death, the loss of the visible marker that announced to the world what they were. The relationship between hair and mourning in the ancient and pre-modern world is a consistent feature across cultures that is worth noting as we conclude this segment. In ancient Egypt, the shaving of the head was a sign of mourning, the reversal of the normal relationship with hair, the voluntary adoption of disorder and plainness in the face of loss. In ancient Greece, cutting the hair short was a mourning practice, the reverse of the long hair that marked the warrior at his best. In Rome, letting the hair grow unattended, refusing the barber, was a sign of grief and disorder. In Japan, the cutting of the top knot could be a mourning practice as well as a retirement one. In almost every ancient culture, hair is the medium through which the relationship between the self and the social world is negotiated, and the disruption of the normal hair order is the most visible sign of the disruption of the normal social order. Hair is not trivial. It never has been. It is one of the few things about the human body that grows and changes and can be shaped according to intention, and the cultures that have taken it seriously have been, in this specific way, correct. We have travelled far tonight, from the physic garden of a 12th century Rhine Valley monastery to the bronze-rammed waters of Salamis, from the royal courts of ancient Persis to the barbershop of a Roman senator, from the wig collection of an Egyptian noblewoman to the topknot of a Japanese warrior. Each of these journeys has taken us into a world where the assumptions are different from our own, different about what is medicine and what is poison, different about what makes a weapon and what makes a fleet, different about what kind of man changes the world and how he does it, different about what a hairstyle means and why it matters. Brother Thomas is still in his garden as the night deepens. He has spent the evening updating his notebook with observations about the henbane plants that have been producing unusually well this autumn, and he is thinking about the dose question that has preoccupied him for 3 years. The relationship between a dose that helps and a dose that harms, the narrow margin between healing and hurting that his plants make visible in ways that his theology makes invisible. He blows out his lamp. The physic garden is dark and fragrant outside the window. He listens to the monastery settle into the night before matins. Nicias is at his oar in the imagination. The fleet is at anchor tonight, and he is lying on the beach beside his ship, listening to the water. He is thinking about the Dieg Plus, and whether tomorrow's practice will produce the coordination the crew needs, and he is thinking about a boy in his crew who has the makings of something exceptional if he can be trained to trust his instinct in the moment rather than waiting to be told what to do. The stars over the Aegean are very bright. The water laps at the bronze of the ram. Tomorrow there will be work to do. Cyrus is at Pasagedek in the garden he has ordered planted, the first formal garden of the Persian tradition, and he is watching the water run in the stone channels that his engineers have cut across the plateau. He has been watching the water run for an hour. He has been thinking about Babylon, about the clay cylinder in the temple foundation, about whether the words that were inscribed on it, the promises about the cult statues, the released captives, the restored temples, will be kept not just now, but after he is gone. He does not know. He knows that the promise mattered enough to make. He returns inside as the night comes. Nefertari is putting her wigs away, each on its stand, each in its proper order. The formal wig goes to the back. The everyday wig goes to the front. The short domestic wig goes between them. She touches the formal wig briefly as she puts it away. The beeswax is fresh. The hair is properly aligned. It will do for the ceremony next week. She blows out her lamp. The wooden stands hold the wigs in the darkness, like 3 patient figures waiting for morning. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are tonight.